Hello, Austen friends. My name's Sarah, and I'm a romance editor and a reader and editor of Jane Austen Fan Fiction, which is also known as JAFF, and I will be your guide through this world today. I've been a fan of JAFF for many, many years, and I'm going to take you through the history as well as some of my theories and observations about it. One of the most interesting things about JAFF in general is that the people in it are constantly disrupting the norms. It's inspired by the works of Austen, who is herself a disruptive force. And then once JAFF starts to really establish itself as a genre, it's constantly breaking the mold of what fanfic can be. So a quick overview of the talk today. I'm going to talk very quickly about early JAFF, which is about 1850 to 1995. Big gap, I know. So this is just going to be a quick overview on how JAFF gets started. And then present 1995 to now, where we get this absolute explosion of everything Austen, especially in online fanfic. And there's tons of disruptions and innovations going on. And then a quick foray into the future where I see this genre of JAFF going in the future. I want to start by defining fanfic, and my definition of fanfic tends to be very loose. It's a transformative work, so any story that uses another story as its base in any kind of media, though for the most part I'll be focusing on written media today. In JAFF, this is usually sequels or prequels, variations where something in the plot gets changed and alters the trajectory of the story, or retellings, which follows the story that we know, but then sees what happens when you put it in a totally different context. I also don't consider written fanfic to only be unpublished work, and to define my terms, we'll say that unpublished means it's posted online only rather than published, which means in print. Especially in JAFF, where we have this whole cottage industry devoted to publishing fan fiction. Some people want to distinguish between unpublished and published work, with unpublished online meaning amateur and published meaning professional. But I think defining unpublished work as amateur really undermines the amount of work and care and research that writers put into it and is an attempt to delegitimize fanfic. In fanfic, the challenge for any author is to make it recognizably part of the fandom, but also to make it their own and offer their own perspective on the story. Fanfic in general tends to get a bad rep. It's considered silly, it's considered less than, it's considered lazy or derivative. Why are you just using somebody else's characters? Why don't you make up your own? But because fanfic is often written by women or people from marginalized backgrounds, it's often an attempt to minimize their work and de-emphasize their importance, its importance, or the work's importance, in something that I think Austen herself would have been very familiar with. But I really do think that fanfic is art, which is a hill I will die on, and all art is political, so there's always something at stake in fanfic. And the work that fanfic does is really important in showing the ways that we interpret Austen's stories, how we use them to make meaning of our own world, and why Austen continues to be relevant and reimagined. So JAFF is the oldest consistent fanfic fandom, at least that I know of, in the Western world. Sherlock Holmes fanfic is maybe its closest rival, but that one doesn't start until about the 1890s, and JAFF has been going on much longer than that. The first JAFF, the first full-length JAFF that we have, is actually by one of Austen's nieces, Catherine Hubach, who finishes The Watsons, one of Austen's unfinished works, in 1850. She never met Austen. She was too young, and she, I believe, was born after Austen passed. But she was the daughter of Austen's brother Frank and the stepdaughter of Martha Lloyd, who was Austen's best friend. And she also had stories from Cassandra, Austen's sister, from the rest of the Austen family, and the entire Austen family knew Jane's stories, so they were very familiar with them. So Catherine publishes the younger sister. We have another niece of Austen's, Anna Lefroy, who is also trying to complete Sanditon around this time in the 1850s. She actually is older than Catherine, so she knew Jane herself. Jane helped her with her writing when she was younger, critiqued it, and she wants to finish Sanditon. She doesn't end up doing it. She gets about 100 pages in and stops. I think there's sort of the anxiety of influence happening there, and how do you match the tone of Austen. Even then, it would have felt like a daunting task. There's a little bit of tea between Catherine and Anna thinking that because Catherine has published her Watson's completion, she might take Sanditon next, and Anna feels very proprietary over that story because she has the autograph copy and she feels like that is hers. In any case, both are emulating their disruptive aunt in becoming female authors. Both of them have other books that they do, and Catherine actually ends up earning her living through her writing for a while, and she fashions herself as Miss Austen's niece in her publications. So Anna and Catherine have access to these manuscripts because they are family, and because so they can actually finish these completions, or they can actually finish these unfinished stories. But we don't really get much going on in terms of anything else in JAFF until about 1913, when the first sequel of Austen's work is published. It's by Sybil Brinton. It's called Old Friends and New Fancies. It takes characters from all 6 of Austen's novels and imagines them after their books, and focuses on the characters who don't get a happy endings in the original stories. So like Colonel Fitzwilliam, Mary Crawford, Kitty Bennett, Georgiana Darcy, James Morland, William Price. And so this kicks off a whole new era in Austen, fanfic that happens outside of the Austen family. From about 1920 to 1995, we get a few sequels and continuations of Sanditon. Sanditon is really big for a while in terms of the kind of JAFF that we're getting. Catherine Huback's granddaughter writes a JAFF in the 20s, but unfortunately there hasn't been much work done on these early fanfics, and not much is known about these early writers. But it's when we hit 1995 that all of this starts to change. What happens in 1995? Well, we get a huge slew of Austen adaptations. We get the iconic BBC Pride and Prejudice. It's just a total cultural reset. We get Emma Thompson's Sense and Sensibility. We get Persuasion. We get Clueless. We get 2 Emmas in 1996. And that's fine. We've had adaptations of Austen before, but it's these ones that are coming right after the other that are creating this frenzy for Austen and making people want to know more about her, more about the works, and more about what happens after these stories. The other thing that's different this time around is the internet, which is on the rise at this point. And Janeites are early adopters of the internet, and this is where they gather to discuss Austen. So we have Austen-specific bulletin boards, email discussion lists, and sites for fanfic that start to spring up. The email boards and the bulletin board lists eventually disappear, but the sites remained. And there are a bunch of sites that have since been shut down or disappeared into the internet ether, which is totally normal. But JAFF fans are loyal as hell, and they follow writers to new fanfic sites and keep these older sites active. So one of the oldest is the Republic of Pemberley, which started in 1996 and still exists today as an archive. The Derbyshire Writers Guild was started in 1997, A Happy Assembly in 2006, and a bunch of others that are still active JAFF-specific fanfic sites, including ones that authors host on their own sites, or on general fanfic sites like fanfiction.net and Archive of Our Own. So writers post their stories online on these sites, and the stories can vary widely in length, from drabbles of 100 words to thousands and thousands, sometimes millions of words, most of which of these long ones are posted serially. And they can be very experimental. They're literally any possible combination of love interests, settings, genre, style, any kind of alteration of character or plot line you can imagine. JAFF has it. And far and away, Pride and Prejudice dominates JAFF. There's more Pride and Prejudice fic than all of the other 5 novels put together. So global media and the internet make fan fiction proliferate, and Janeites are really at the forefront of this. At this point in time, when the internet and fanfic are really exploding, the idea of what a fan text can be and how one can participate in the fandom is changing and allowing for a lot more flexibility and innovation, and we see this in a number of different ways. So in the types of fanfic that are being published, the format in terms of publishing and on other platforms, the depth of engagement, and then other media. Very quickly, what we start to see with online JAFF around this mid to late 90s period is that we're not just getting sequels or completions like we've gotten a lot of in the past prior to 1995. These things are still there, of course, but we're getting a lot more alternate universe fics, a lot more what ifs or variations, and a lot more retellings, and not just Regencies, but moderns as well, although the Regencies always tend to dominate. And also, people don't have to write full-length novels anymore to end up publishing their JAFF works. And the idea of publishing isn't really there right now. So you don't have, you can write a very short story that focuses tightly on certain moments in the original novel, and there's a lot more freedom to play here. This is a really interesting change that I think is happening. So I want to pull back and look at what's going on with fanfic in general at this time. So while we've had fanfic of stories and people forever, basically, fanfic about other kinds of media from TV or film isn't very old, mostly because TV and film aren't really very old at this time either. I'm fairly certain that people were probably writing fanfic about movies ever since film became a medium, but there wasn't really very many places where they could gather and find a community to share them in. So the TV fandom really gets going with Star Trek, and they eventually have, you know, conventions and places where people can be fans together, and they have zines where people can submit fanfic and art, and that is sort of starting this really this nascent fan culture and building up the idea of what fanfic will shape itself into. Because by nature TV shows are generally episodic, creating something new every week rather than following like a centuries old plot like it does in the book in 200 or 300 pages. Fanfic writers for these shows are really emboldened to start creating something new based on canon stories of the show, so it can veer off into these AUs or what if territory much more easily, because they're open to the kind of imaginative possibilities that they're seeing in their show every week. And as such, the fanfic in general starts to innovate a lot more quickly this way. And my theory is that Austen fanfic itself starts to develop away from these sequels and completions and focus more on variations and retellings, partly because of length and also because of this influence from other fandoms and the kinds of innovations that they're making in fanfic. And then from there, JAFF starts to develop its own shorthand, its own fanon, its own conventions, and then its own innovations. So we're now getting into the new age of self-publishing, still in the late mid-90s, and JAFF writers are getting in on the ground floor of this. So we have The Bar Sinister by Linda Burdell, which is later titled Mr. Darcy Takes a Wife. It's a kind of racy sequel to Pride and Prejudice that has that really sort of kicks off this idea of self-publishing JAFF. This happens in 1999. A little bit later, Pamela Aden publishes her series called Fitzwilliam Darcy Gentleman. It's originally posted online, but then she creates her own publishing company to sell it in print. And when traditional publishing comes calling, she turns them down because she's making more money independently. And this is pre-ebooks, so this is a huge disruption. And what it does is the ability for these books to sell on their own independently without the infrastructure behind them shows that JAFF is actually a viable genre in itself before anyone else really realizes it. So other authors also start self-publishing more for their readers on the sites than anything, but they're still finding an audience outside of that. JAFF readers tend to be very loyal to their writers, and they're just excited to buy these stories that they love and to be able to hold them in their hands. And then once Kindle comes out and modern ebook publishing really develops, again, we see a lot of JAFF writers really being early adopters here. They already have these full-length novels that they've been posting online, and they have an audience who is keen to support them. And also, this is early in the Kindle store, and there's like, now we have millions and millions of books on the Kindle store, but back then, say like 2010, 2011, there wasn't much there. So JAFF is up early, and it's up front and center on those digital shelves. And the boards and the sites are still continuing to produce online JAFF of varying lengths, but now in the indie publishing space, there's a whole thriving cottage industry of JAFF variations. And the number of these published JAFF increases year over year. So now there are literally hundreds of new JAFF being published every year. Like I said, many of these started as online fanfic on the JAFF boards, but some of them are done independently. So people are not using the boards to sort of test out their work before and just immediately going to publishing. But the audience is there and it is voracious for any new JAFF. So traditional publishing starts to take notice of JAFF in about the mid-aughts, and we get a publisher's sourcebooks buying up a bunch of JAFF that was previously published online. But they don't super understand the market, and JAFF writers are making more on their own, and they don't really need the cachet and the authority of a traditional publisher backing them up anymore. But the real boon of this early interest in publishing JAFF is that these books get into libraries. And now it's relatively easy for indies to get into libraries. Still a little bit difficult, but back then it was virtually almost impossible. So because they are traditionally published, they get into libraries and they drive a whole new audience of readers to online JAFF, which continues to propagate and to build an audience. So this kind of publication of JAFF predates what we see now in things like 50 Shades, which was a fanfic of Twilight, After, which was a Wattpad fanfic, Star Wars fanfic. What we see is them filing off the serial numbers, which is a fanfic term for making sure that you don't have any identifying marks of the fandom. Because they aren't in the public domain. Because Austen is in the public domain, this isn't a problem in JAFF. And these JAFF writers show that it's possible that fanfic itself can be a viable commercial success. So I want to make a distinction between traditional publishing and this indie cottage industry of publishing that flows from the online space for JAFF. You'll see from the big 5 publishers every year at least a few JAFF per year, and usually in romance or in YA. And you should definitely check out Nikki Payne's talk at Virtual JaneCon this weekend, and Amanda Quain and JC Peterson's talk. I think they'll both be really informative about how the trad side of publishing JAFF works. But these trad stories, these trad JAFF often tend to be retellings, I think, retellings in a modern context, and focus on characters, of different characters rather than the usual protagonists, while indie JAFF tend to be more variations. So they're spinning the story out from a different premise rather than sort of starting at the beginning of the base story from Austen. My theory about this relates to the target audiences of both the trad and the indie side of JAFF publication. The trad side tends to be appealing, I think, to people who know the basic story of Pride and Prejudice or whatever Austen story is being used. They don't necessarily have that story memorized backwards and forwards, but they've maybe read the book before, they've definitely seen an adaptation, and they know that they'll enjoy it. Interestingly, I think you get a lot more diversity in characters in traditional publishing, and you can kind of see how Austen stories can work in any kind of culture or environment. And also because they're modern retellings, they feel a bit more applicable to a broader, wider modern audience, and you see what matters to that audience. While on the indie side of publishing, it's really for those die-hard Austen fans who do know the story backwards and forwards. They can catch those teeny tiny details that the casual Austen fan might not have noticed. They've done, deep dives into Austen's life and context. So these indie authors have a different starting point because they know their audience has a really strong understanding of the story already. And often, almost overwhelmingly, they're Regency stories that are being published or being done on the indie side. And it's basically a Regency story, not always, but often a Regency story and a variation that says, okay, let's start by changing this one tiny thing and then see what the butterfly effect is. So it really depends on how deeply you want to engage in Austen fanfic. If you want to just dip your toe in, you maybe try a trad book. If you want to explore some wild theories or pairings, I'm reading right now a Regency Mary Bennett and Wickham fic that works. If you want something wild like that, then hit up indie. I want to touch very briefly on different kinds of formats and platforms or media that we can explore fanfic in. I know I've mostly been talking about written fanfic, but there are so many more ways to engage with fanfic now. And obviously there continues to be adaptations of Austen in written stories and TV and movies and plays. For that, you should check out Latisha Jones's The Bennett Sisters play reading at Virtual JaneCon this weekend. But there are also new ways to create fanfic. I was a huge fan of the Lizzie Bennett Diaries, which was an Emmy-winning web series that ran on YouTube from 2012 to 2013 in bi-weekly installments with this wonderful, diverse cast that puts the story of Pride and Prejudice into modern-day California. It also used transmedia to deepen the story and to invite the viewer to engage directly with the characters on social media platforms like Twitter and Tumblr and side YouTube channels. And this kicks off this huge trend of literary web series. Each of Austen's books, I think, gets a web series treatment at some point, as do a bunch of other works from classic literature. There was also just last month a Spotify exclusive podcast series called Gay Pride and Prejudice, telling the story over weekly episodes with Bennett, who is the male Lizzie Bennett counterpart, who's a Boston high school teacher, and then Darcy, who is an ex-football player. So we get these different ways that we can consume these retellings or reimaginings of Austen stories. And I think Austen stories are prime material for these new kinds of formats because Austen is so reliable and recognizable and also just endlessly adaptable. Her stories are familiar and comfortable, and even if the project itself seems risky because of this new format that they need to get people on board with, Austen will almost certainly bring in an audience and hopefully get them to stick around for more from this kind of media. So for the future, where is JAFF going? Well, first of all, I think there is going to be less online fanfic. I'm afraid that the boards, the sites are kind of slowly dying because right now you can get your workout, writers can get their workout quickly and make money at the same time by putting it up for sale on Amazon and bypass the boards entirely. But there's a totally different vibe of posting serially versus just immediately going to publishing. There's feedback that you can get to apply to the next chapter if you're writing a work in progress. You can keep momentum going because you have readers clamoring for more on the boards. You learn how to write to keep readers on the hook and keep coming back every week, and which is great practice to keep readers turning the page of your physical book. And you just get to test out your story on readers first. And I think it would be a shame to lose that. But I also think that it is just maybe a natural cycle that platforms change. I also think that whatever the latest platform is for storytelling, you will almost certainly find Austen there and probably at the very beginning of that platform, whether it's TikTok or podcasts or whatever is next on the horizon. I don't think JAFF is going anywhere. It will continue to thrive in its own way, whether that's on fanfic sites or somewhere else. And you will probably find JAFF writers or reinterpreters at the front of the line doing it. I think that every new generation is going to discover Austen in their own way and make it their own and find new ways to reinterpret and reimagine her stories, and then find the best way to get it out into the world and to the audience that needs it. There is so much more that I could say about JAFF and so much history that I had to glide over, and this is probably way too long already. But I hope this talk whet your appetite to jump into the world of JAFF. There is truly something for everyone and always something new to discover. Thank you so much for watching.